Hi, I'm Alex Maple. I'm an associate here at RBR. Great to be speaking with you. We're going to talk about the future of cash post-pandemic. And of course, there's been a lot of changes in the world over the last few years. And of course, cash usage, cash withdrawals at the ATM is also something that has changed quite a bit too. So we can see here from the first slide, looks at the total value of cash withdrawn from ATMs by region and the world and comparing that with the 2017 figure. So for example, on this slide, we can see that in 2021, the total value of cash withdrawn from ATMs in North America was over 15% the figure that there was in 2017. Now, the North America figure is very, very high compared to the other regions, which have seen more of a decline, and we'll come to what's driving that in a moment. But let's have a look at some of the other regions. We can see there that Central and Eastern Europe is roughly coming out at the same level as it was back in 2017, having gone up and then down. And we can see that some of the other regions have perhaps seen withdrawals at the ATM, the value of cash withdrawn at the ATM go down a bit more. Now the line at the bottom there, that is the line for Asia Pacific, and that seems like quite a big drop. But it is worth saying that a large part of that is because of China, because of various specific circumstances in the Chinese market, particularly the growing use of WeChat and Alipay. Because of that, and because of the size of China, that's actually distorting that line somewhat. So in reality, in the rest of the Asia Pacific region, it's not quite as impacted as it may seem from looking at the chart. We can also see there that going into the pandemic year of 2020, that the drop for Western Europe is quite strong. And that's because in Western European countries, there were many restrictions being placed that actually prevented people from going outside, doing normal things. And this is one of the reasons why the actual value of cash in that region dropped quite a lot. And it's also worth noting there that the value of cash withdrawn at ATMs in Latin America also was down quite a bit there. That's because of the nature of the pandemic in Latin America. And you can see there in 2021 that because things were quite still bad in the region in 2021 in terms of COVID, that's the reason why the value of cash withdrawn has not really recovered too much. But you can see there in most regions that there is a slight increase there in 2021, and that suggests that going into 2022, that the value of cash withdrawn will carry on going back up towards that 2017 level. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple of country examples which we think are quite interesting. And the first of this is the UK. And we can see there from the line, now just to say that this is the total value of cash withdrawn at ATMs by month. And looking at that, the time series is the last 3.5 years. We can see there from the 2019 line that about 9 to 10 billion pounds worth of cash was withdrawn from each ATM each month. But then we can see what happens in 2020. There's a huge drop around March and April, and that's when the pandemic hits. And then after that, it recovers, and around the middle of the year, it reaches about 7 billion pounds per month being withdrawn from UK ATMs. But what's really interesting is that it carries on remaining at that 7 million level. Yes, there are occasions when it's a bit lower, but that's mainly because of restrictions and other things. You can see there that in 2021, it's going back to that 7 billion level, and also in 2022, it's at about that 7 billion level as well. Now, of course, you might look at that particular chart and you might think, oh, that doesn't look good from a cash perspective, but I prefer to look at it a bit differently, because of course the UK, as we know, is a very mature market. It's a market which has a lot of card acceptance. People in the UK are very used to the idea that they can go into any shop or any retailer and pay using their cards. And so even though it is a mature market, even though people can use their cards, contactless cards, easily, you can still see that around 70% of the previous level of cash withdrawn is still being withdrawn. And in actual fact, that shows us that cash use in the UK is still very resilient. So let's have a quick look now at the United States, and this is even more interesting actually. This is the total value of cash withdrawn from ATMs using MasterCard and Visa cards, and it's done by quarter, and we can see there the last few years, very, very interesting movements. In 2019, we can see that each quarter about $210 billion is being withdrawn from ATMs. And then we can see what happens in 2020. There's this large increase around Q3, and that's because of government giving people stimulus payments. The economic situation has gotten worse, and the government is giving people money. They're giving people money via their debit cards, through checking accounts, current accounts, and also via prepaid cards. And what happens is that people take that money in their account and they go to the ATM and they take it out as cash. And you can see the effect of that also in 2021, where there were more benefit payments being given to people, and you can see that the line is way higher than 2019. Now it drops off a bit towards the end of 2021, as we can see, and that's because the payments have stopped. But you can still see how in 2022 that line is still very strong, despite the fact that the benefit payments have stopped. So even in a country that's a mature market like the United States, it's a country where contactless payments, card payments generally are growing as well. You can still see that the cash withdrawn at the ATM, that figure, the value of cash withdrawn at the ATM in the United States, still going up as well. Again, it goes to show how resilient cash can be in many mature markets. So let's go back to the UK. And this is an interesting slide. It just details one of the interesting things that's happening in the UK. Obviously, it's a mature market. Over time, cash use has just gone down. We saw that in the previous slide about the UK. And of course, over time, long term, we would expect more people to use cards and fewer people to use cash. But right now in the UK, we have something called the cost of living crisis. And this is about the increasing costs of food, energy, gas bills, petrol bills, etc. Some people are actually going back to using cash from cards. Why is that? Well, that's because they believe that cash is a very good budgeting tool. It's because they believe that the physical money in their hands allows them to keep track of their spending, and perhaps maybe they find it a bit more difficult to keep track of their spending when it's all electronic and they can't see the cash. So this is a very, very interesting point, and it's related to this next slide, which is about the types of people in the UK who are more likely to prefer using cash. And what this slide shows is that this is a report from an organisation called RSA, and what's really interesting is that they've segmented the UK population into 5 groups, from those who are most likely to use cash and to those who are least likely to use cash. And what's really interesting is that they've, through their extensive survey, they've looked at this and they've actually come up with some figures for the number of people who would struggle if there was a cashless society. And as you can see, out of a population of about 65 million, about 10 to 15 million people would struggle if there was a cashless society. Now, of course, the UK isn't a cashless society. People can still use banknotes. They like using them. But I think it's interesting how even in an extreme situation where cash was effectively banned, you still have 10 to 15 million people who would really struggle. And that really goes to show again how resilient cash use is in the UK. Yes, of course, there are going to be some older people who, as time goes on, they will not be around, and maybe their habits will change, they won't be affecting the figures. But there are always going to be those people down the socio-economic scale, those who in the grey economy, who will still want to use cash. And one of the other points that's related to this slide is that in this report, it actually shows that in 2020, the drop-off in cash usage, the decline in cash usage, was actually much greater in those more affluent areas, but the drop-off in cash usage was much less, about half less, in those areas that were poorer. So certain demographics, like poorer people, they tend to use cash more. So what have we learnt in this section? Well, I suppose what we can say is that cash usage is still very resilient. Even though electronic payments are going up in lots of markets, there are lots of people who still like using cash, and we can expect cash usage to stay strong and resilient in emerging markets, but also mature markets as well. Thanks very much.